Chef Holton here. Thanks for watching the Hot Zone. I've got my friend Michael Yon with me today. He's been staying up here with us in Panama for a few days. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the coming famine, I think maybe global famine, that will very likely happen over the next 12 to 24 months. Michael has been doing a lot of research on that. And so I just wanted to have a discussion about this because I think it's going to affect all of us, actually. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no question everybody's going to be affected.
So let's just back up a little bit. I mean, what we've seen even just in the last, since February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine obviously breadbasket of Europe and much of Africa and the Middle East. And so there's no wheat coming out of Ukraine. There's no wheat coming out of Russia right now with all the sanctions and everything. And so that in and of itself could very well cause localized famine in places that were already on the verge of famine in North Africa and Middle East, and Lebanon with that huge explosion that blew up their grain storage last year. With Egypt, which gets over 80% of its grain from Ukraine and Russia, now going already, the price is shooting up. Armenia, where I've been recently, where prices are already going through the roof. We've seen food shortages in Russia even. And I just read an article today about Russia stealing a ship and filling it full of grain and trying to sneak it into port in Alexandria, Egypt, to try to sell it to the Egyptians. And the Ukrainians were able to stop it and try to get that ship arrested, basically. So let's talk a little bit about what you've been seeing, especially from the standpoint of the research that you've been doing, the books you've been reading on famine. Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. Well, as you know, I've been warning about it since January of 2020 because I've studied as a war correspondent in my more thin days. This is worth a lot of money in the coming famines. I'm calculating it. But you know, pandemic, famine, and war are the three musketeers. They go together and they create something called HOP, human osmotic pressure, which is the push and pull of migration, right?
Which we've already seen in the last 10 years all over the world.
Exactly. So, and you can see the globalists have been, say, warning or let's say signaling 1.2 billion people will migrate with the coming global warming and this sorts of things and climate change. And you can see they're making good on their, I would call them threats actually, because these famines are clearly manufactured. Actually, let me backstep a little bit. When the pandemic started, I was in Hong Kong, covering the fighting in Hong Kong, as you know. And so I had, since as a war correspondent, had studied famine and especially pandemic quite a lot. And so I was right on the front edge of this pandemic and warning in January of 2020 that something wasn't right. And then in January of 2020, I started to say, stock up on food. Because when you have a big pandemic, you'll have famines and then you'll have war. They just recurse into each other. It's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we can talk about why pandemics create famines and famines create pandemics and they all create war. They have specific reasons for it. But the bottom line is it's happening. And so for the first, well, even up until like 2 months ago, a lot of people didn't believe it. Then finally, you know, various presidents and world leaders come out and say things very late, as they normally do. And so now, you know, things that I wanted to say publicly, I was mostly saying privately, and being mindful of the Overton window. The Overton window is that range of things that you can say without being discarded as a kook or a quack or a conspiracy theorist, right? So if you go too far, then people just turn you off.
Yeah, right? Things that are considered normal I mean, there's an Overton window for lots of things, but you know, the things that, for example, in fashion, dresses that would have gotten you thrown out of a bar 20 years ago, you'll see people wearing in church today. So that's the Overton window has shifted.
Right.
And I think now people's expectations are starting to shift because they're starting to see the supply chain disruptions, the food shortages, the shortages even in grocery stores in the United States. Of, you know, staple foods even.
Right.
And prices are definitely going up around the world. I just got advised today that the fuel bill for our upcoming tour to Armenia is going to go up by $400 for 10 days in Armenia just because of the increase in the cost of diesel. Well, if the cost of fuel goes up, obviously, in some cases, about 80% of the cost of the vegetables and foods, fresh foods that we buy is tied up in the cost of transportation. As transportation goes up, the cost of food goes up, and that disproportionately impacts the people who can least afford it.
Right. You know, one thing that's very interesting is reading history is like cheating. I feel like I'm reading all the answers in advance. And, you know, I'm on my about 16th book now on famine, which to me is like just starting a recon on it. I've never been in a famine. I've been in a lot of war and that sort of thing. And we've all seen this sort of fake pandemic. But it was treated as if it were real, so the effects are as if it were a real pandemic, right? And so one thing that I find quite interesting, though, is that the patterns are quite clear. Like you were just recently in Egypt, and in these historical patterns, whether they were in the 1700s or the 1800s or recently in China with Mao's famine that may have killed 50 million people, nobody knows how many, or the Holodomor in Ukraine, or the Hungerwinter in Netherlands in 44, 45, the similarities are striking. And it's interesting because when you were in Egypt and you were starting to tell me biblical accounts of what happened in Egypt, I was saying, you know, I was thinking after we hung up, when you get home, I just want to put the camera on and let you talk for like 2 hours, you know, because what you were saying about Egypt from biblical accounts is no different than what I read about now, you know, or with Mao or so. It's the same pattern.
We were talking about the story out of Genesis 41 that where Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt and eventually became worked his way up and became the number 2 guy in Egypt. In Egyptian, they called him Imhotep, and now, but his biblical name was Joseph. And he foresaw through the dreams of the Pharaoh the famines that would come, and he was shown 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And so he suggested to the Pharaoh that they stock up in the 7 years of plenty so that they'd be able to make it through the famine. Pharaoh essentially said, okay, that's your baby. And he did. He created these enormous granaries that we actually got to see when we were over there in Egypt a few weeks ago. And
that was fascinating.
Oh, it's incredible! It's incredible, and
the
just the administration that he put into that, for the system that they put into place in order to, in an orderly fashion, feed people. They ended up feeding, the Bible says, the whole world at that time, and saving just millions of people through that famine. But it also made Egypt a superpower in the ancient world and gave them the money that they needed to build the Great Pyramids. So it was very profitable for them, and that's kind of what it comes down to with this famine. There are people who are going to greatly benefit from the coming shortages, and who are those people going to be?
First of all, the people that recognize it and have prepared. For instance, if you're waiting until now, you still have a little time, but you're going to pay a lot more. And I say a little time, but you're not going to have until October or November. I mean, we're clearly getting down to the wire here. And I would say within 90 days or so, I'll bet you will start seeing food riots in the United States. And let's talk about something. You talked about 7 years, right? And most famines only last for a couple years. That's most, but there are some that do go that long or even longer. But there's different types of famines. There's some, the one you describe in Egypt, you just kind of fade into it and you fade out of it, right? And it's like a slow fuse. And there's others like the Hungerwinter in 1944-45 in the Netherlands when the Nazis pushed the Dutch back up against some really bad weather in the sea. That was a sudden famine. That was like a light switch. So in late 1944, Nazis pushed them back, went straight into famine. And then in about, I think, May of 1945, it just suddenly was over because we beat the Nazis back and that sort of thing. And so, but then what we're going into now is the slow fuse in, and it'll clearly be a slow fuse out at some point. But right now, go ahead.
Well, and we're already seeing people in underserved areas or underprivileged areas, I guess, around the world. You're talking about, you know, places like Syria, places like North Africa. They're already suffering from hunger, and it's just slowly marching up the food chain to the Western countries. We are seeing shortages. We are seeing, you know, it's getting more expensive. Again, when it gets more expensive, it disproportionately affects the people who can least afford it. And so hunger in the United States especially often gets kind of hidden. There are programs in place, but there are people in Appalachia who are going hungry now. There are people in Detroit who are going hungry now. And we just came from Cartagena. And we're seeing people there.
Colombia, South America.
Cartagena, Colombia, yeah. These Venezuelans that we were with who actually, we've been providing them a place to live for a year now. We've been renting an apartment for them because when we found this single mother and her children, they were living in a one-room little shack with dirt floor, no water, no electricity, just a bed, and that was it. And obviously very unsanitary conditions. And so we put them into an apartment with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen, and a living room, and a secure area for the kids to play. We've been paying for that for a year. That it's enabled them with the work that they do, which is not much, but they can at least eat. But the cost of food has gotten higher and higher and higher. Now she's had to take in cousins and friends, 2 other single mothers and their children. Now there are 11 people living in this 2-bedroom apartment. And this 2-bedroom apartment is the size of my office. That the whole apartment is
right.
the size of this room that we're sitting in, right? And they've got 2 beds for 11 people. And they have people
an apartment this size for 11 people.
For 11 people, and again, only 2 beds. So the one kind of double bed and 1 queen-size bed. They have 6 children sleeping in 1 queen-size bed, 2 women sleeping in another bed, and the rest of people just crash on the floor. But when we walked in there, it was absolutely sweltering. They have no air conditioning in there, and so it's just so hot.
Is it one of those ceiling things like we saw in Mexico?
No, this was actually underneath, so it was less hot than the one upstairs would have been. But we walked into this place, and I looked in the kitchen, and there was literally a tiny bag of pasta. That was all they had for food. They don't have a refrigerator.
Right.
They had a tiny bag of pasta for 11 people. And whatever they happen to, what they do for a living is they go out and they sell candy on the street.
Right.
They buy a bag of candy for, 8,000 pesos, and they sell it, and they end up making about 40,000 pesos, which is they'll make about $10. And so
we saw them doing that when I was with you.
Right.
At
Yes.
the traffic
Yes.
stop.
Actually, yeah. We met some of these girls when you were there. So they make just enough money to keep themselves fed, but it's getting harder and harder and harder as the prices of things go up. The price of that spaghetti pasta has gone up by 1/3 already this year. So anything that's based on wheat is going to go up. Anything that needs fuel to be delivered is going to go up that's not locally produced. And so not only is it probably going to affect you, our viewers, anybody that's watching this, but it probably won't affect you near as much as it will everybody else. But when it affects them, then those people affect us because they start coming across the U.S. southern border looking for help. And more people around the world are going to need help, and it's just going to exacerbate the problems that we're already seeing. Now, talk for a minute about how the government programs are actually making this worse.
Oh, in so many ways. I'm reading a book now on Mao's famine, the one that killed maybe 50 million people. And it was all about government programs. I mean, that was what did it. For instance, when people don't have ownership, they don't take pride of ownership. You've talked about this many times. I mean, I watch your podcast. We've talked about it personally. When you don't have pride of ownership, like for your farming tools and your tractors and all these things, they don't maintain them. And they were in this book on Mao's famine. They're talking about how farming tools, when they became the commune's tools, people stopped taking care of them.
Of course, yeah.
Like instantly, they're like tools that usually would have lasted up to 17 years or whatever. Now last maybe 6 months. That sort of thing.
Yep.
And
especially anything that's like a machine. We've seen in Africa where a missions group will go in and install a water pump, a diesel-powered water pump for a village, but nobody in the village knows how to run it, and so they'll try to teach somebody. But you didn't sacrifice for this water pump, so you don't have a lot invested in it. And so what they'll find is they'll wreck it. It'll actually get wrecked within just a matter of months.
That happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. You saw that over and over and over. And it happens in America in the projects.
That's right.
Nobody owns them, so they just destroy them.
They just wreck them. And, that is a huge problem around the world, but it only, again, these programs tend to make the problem worse. So then the question is, what's the right solution for this? I mean, obviously voting out the people who are causing this, but what can people do in their everyday lives to not only prepare for this, but to be able to help lessen the impact as time goes on? What have you seen in the books you've read about it?
I'll tell you one thing. An older man said when I was a younger man, first take care of yourself, because you can't help anybody else if you're not squared away. So first we have to make sure we're squared away. So I've put a lot of effort into food security and that sort of thing over the last couple of years. And then I'm going to cash this in when the prices go very high. And I'm not even joking. And although it may sound funny, because it is. But the point is first take care of yourself, and do it now if you haven't done it. And often people say, well, I've got 3 weeks of food, and that's pretty good. And I'm like, no, it's not. We're talking at least 2 years minimum of what's coming. You can see that. The flash to bang is slow, but it's going to be a big bang.
So you need to be thinking about something that's a little more sustainable than just going to Aldi's and stocking up on canned goods. I mean, that's obviously important.
And learning how to can.
Well, yeah, there you go. Some of those ancient wisdom kind of things that have been lost in today's culture. When you think that 100 years ago, 90% of the culture was involved in homesteading, in small farming, and grew much of their own crops. Now it's less than, it's probably about 3%. Okay, of the population that knows anything about. I mean, do you know how to can? Do you know how to, slaughter a chicken or a hog or anything like that? Do you know how to raise those things? Do you have any place to do that? Even if you live in the city, there are some good websites. Actually, I used to own a website called Homesteading Today that was dedicated to helping people maintain that knowledge base. And so you can go to Homesteading Today even right now, and there's millions of archived articles, and you can ask questions. And it might sound crazy to start raising chickens in your backyard, but that might be what we're coming to. If you want to have fresh eggs, if you want to be able to help your neighbors, having some kind of sustainable food source is going to be currency as things continue to get worse. And you know what? The worst thing that happens, if it turns out that we're completely wrong and none of this ever happens, and you can still go to Walmart and get everything you need, well, then you learn something, and your kids got to have some fun raising some chickens. I think chickens are great. They're easy to raise. They don't take a lot of space. It doesn't take a lot. I mean, they eat basically all the scraps that the food scraps that you make out of your, and it's better than eating your dogs and cats.
Yeah,
so,
and they taste like chicken.
They do. They taste just like chicken. So chickens, rabbits, things like that, are always a good source. You also need to think about water security. You also need to think about your own physical security, because if you're the family that's got 2 years of food stored up and your neighbors know about it, guess where they're going to come looking when things get really bad. I think that we have started to see a shift in people's mindsets after the pandemic to moving away from population centers, realizing, I can work online. I don't need to live in New York City. I was just in New York City. What a horrific place. That place is a zombie apocalypse waiting to happen. And if you live in the city and you're completely reliant on that, understand that cities only have maybe 2 or 3 days worth of food. And if the supply stops coming, it turns into zombie apocalypse in very short order. And so we might sound crazy to talk about this kind of stuff, but it is important. It is something that I'm seeing and that you're seeing as we travel around the world, and we go places that are outside of your safe little bubble. I can tell you that this is something that is becoming very real around the globe right now, and it's creeping towards your safe little bubble. And if you wait until it gets to you, it's going to be far too late. You agree?
Oh, 100%. And speaking of New York, I have a friend that I knew from the Army, lives in Manhattan, intelligence professional, was in the Army and then civilian. And, we're chatting the other day, and she's like, what are you talking about, global famine? This is an intelligence professional. Mm-hmm. Totally missed it up until right now and said, what are you trying to scare people for? That is scary when you have people like that who really should know, and she's quite smart, but in that bubble and completely unprepared. Mm-hmm. And at one point she said, it's no problem. I buy from local markets. I'm like, that's like saying you get from Uber Eats. You know, it's like it's not. I'm not going to have a famine. I'll just order
I'll
a
go to
pizza.
McDonald's. You know, it's
Get a pizza.
Yeah, we've literally seen in places around the world where I've been recently, in Europe, okay, where you go to McDonald's and you can't get certain items because
Japan.
they're completely out of stuff. They can't get it. And even just in Colombia recently, yesterday, we were seeing stuff like that where you ask for a certain, like you ask for pork or ask for beef, and they go, we can't get that right now. Right. There is a very high likelihood, and very high, that this is going to affect you. And I wanted to bring Michael on and just sort of talk to you a little bit about that. The experts have been completely wrong on just about everything as far back as we can tell.
But we haven't been because we're not experts. We just go everywhere and see it with our own eyes.
All I'm telling you about is what I'm seeing in places other than the United States.
Remember, you were just in Ukraine. Remember, just before the war, people were like, everything's fine. Just like I remember, because I'd call you up on the phone.
And I was like, yeah, it was just normal.
Yeah.
Like,
and now,
life.
and so that was less than 70 days ago, right?
Yep.
About 70?
Yep.
And now their shelves are empty. And now Ukraine, breadbasket of the world, is now facing potential, probable
they are.
famine.
And they've got millions of tons of grain in the silos,
just 2
but
months.
They can't do anything with it. They don't have the processing capacity to even feed their own people. Stuff's not getting put in the ground. The winter wheat's not being harvested over there. So to a large extent, unless some miracle happens, and I think you can never, you have to always take into account the ingenuity that people have.
Yeah, that's true.
When people are hungry, they can get pretty creative, right? And so there are lots of ways that people could think of to get around this to some extent, to soften the blow to some extent. But a lot of people are already going hungry. David Beasley of the World Food Program. I know David. I like David. I'm not really hot on the World Food Program, but he goes a lot of places and he sees this stuff
pretty
firsthand.
smart. I've been
He's
watching
a smart
him.
guy,
Yeah.
and he's saying there are already tens, if not hundreds of millions of people who are going hungry right now. When those people go hungry, there's a ripple effect that's going to make it to us. It's already more costly, but it's going to continue to get more costly. So you might want to start thinking about ways to soften the blow for you and your family. And if you have questions, put them in the comments here. You can follow Michael at his locals. It's michaelyan.locals.com.
Yeah,
is that
michaelyan.locals.com.
Okay, and at me, chuckholton.locals.com. You should read the stuff that he's putting out, even if you think he's a kook, which everybody, I know him personally. He's not a kook. He's a very smart guy, and he literally has been ahead of the curve on a lot of this stuff going back for years because he's so immersed in it. And so he does the work so you won't have to. He's a good guy to listen to. People like General Petraeus and lots of other very smart people in government are reading his stuff, are listening to what he has to say, so you should too. I highly recommend it. Thanks for watching the Hot Zone today. We appreciate it. We will be back again next week. I'm headed to the United States, and from there to Greece, and from there to Armenia, and from there back to Ukraine. So we got a lot of good stuff coming. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.